Welcome back, my favorite Hasidim. Today we are talking about ancient Christian Judophilia. What on earth is that? And Christian Judaizers. Well, we're going to be getting into what exactly that is, what all these people were doing, why are they important, why have you perhaps never heard of them, and we're going to be getting into what they were like and their connections to the past and to their contemporary fellows. And so basically what today's PowerPoint video is going to be about is the love of some ancient Gentiles, Gentile Christians, for the Jewish people and for the Jewish faith. And as always, here are our sources. As you'll see, we don't have as many this week because we're talking about a very specific issue, and it's not the most popularly written about subject. And so the book that we're going to be using primarily is In the Shadow of the Temple, Jewish Influences on Early Christianity by Professor Oscar Skarsona, who I believe he's Norwegian, but I'm not sure. And that's not relevant to what we're talking about today, but it's kind of a fun fact. But anyways, we're also going to be using our thin little blue book here, Early Christianity, A Brief History by Yosef Ha Linch. If he was Jewish, maybe that's what we would be calling him. But he's probably not, so he's just Joseph Lynch for us today. So getting into our outline here, let's remember that the previous PowerPoint we did about Gentiles and their perceptions about Judaism. So if we remember, some Christians' dislike of the Jews increased as time went on. So they inherited this anti-Semitism from the Romans, where it wasn't this ferocious anti-Semitism where it's, kill the Jews, they're evil. It's more of just, these are foreigners, we don't like them, they're weird, and they don't respect our gods. They're bad people. But it wasn't specifically because they were Jews. And this starts to change where this, what you might call soft anti-Semitism, where the Romans hated other people for the same reasons, so they weren't just targeting the Jews, although it happened sometimes, it wasn't the most common. But once we start getting into the development of Christianity, we start seeing the targeting of Jews and Judaism. So this is really what we might think of as anti-Semitism, even if the word anti-Semitism is a bit anachronistic. So we last discussed some Christians' dislike of the Jews and how this was increasing, but some Christians' love for the Jews increased. And so if you look on the website, newheartnewspirit.com/classroom, if you go down to the early church section, then, and I forget exactly what we're calling it, but if you go down to that section and you click on it, you'll come to the page, and for this week's lesson, we have an article about anti-Semitism of the early church fathers. And so that's basically going to be the counterpart to this video. And it's not really something that I wanted to go through. I didn't think that it would really be worth it. And honestly, I thought that this would be much more interesting because it's less well known. And so we have an article up there with just some quotes from a few guys here and there throughout the first few centuries, along with, I think, Martin Luther and John Calvin, which are a bit late for our purposes, but we'll be discussing them later, God willing, once we get into the 15 and 1600s. And so that article will cover the negative attitudes, but this video will try to cover the positive attitudes that some Christians had toward Jews. So while the trend toward hatred of the Jews actually increased overall, this is kind of where the majority of Christians were going, there were some that resisted the religious culture of their day and believed in fulfilling the golden rule even toward Jews. And by the way, when I say that this was the trend of the majority of people, I'm not saying that most Christians were anti-Semitic. I am saying, though, that most of their leaders were, and eventually these leaders moved the lay people, the masses, over centuries, and this kind of just became the mainstream Orthodox thing to do. And so, with that said, we're going to be getting into defining our terms. That's always very important when we're having a discussion that matters, which here at New Heart, New Spirit, we try to only have discussions that matter. And then after that, we're going to be talking about continuity with the Nazarenes. So as we know, the Nazarenes were these original Jewish believers and followers of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Yeshua himself. And Christianity was this Gentile phenomenon that was rooted in, connected with, and inspired by the Nazarenes. And it was basically the Gentile branch of Notzrut, Nazarenism. And so we'll be talking about that a little bit. Then we'll also be getting into Gentile Christians' respect and love and admiration for rabbis and the synagogues. And we're going to be talking about how they would go to the rabbis for legal opinions. They would go to the synagogues during the holidays. They would fast on Yom Kippur. And this is actually, not something that we have to make up. We have the historical documents proving that they did. And there's also a lot of circumstantial evidence, which can only help us. And so, like I said, they were sharing holidays, they were sharing Shabbat, the Sabbath, and so on. And so, getting into defining our terms here, what does it mean to Judaize? We could use a number of different sources for the definition of this, but I think everybody kind of knows what this means. But I'm using Merriam-Webster's dictionary's definition, which is basically to adopt the customs, beliefs, or character of a Jew. Right? This is kind of the idea that we're going with here. So, if you are Judaizing yourself, you are becoming more Jewish. You are adopting Jewish customs, Jewish beliefs, Jewish character, Jewish practices, Jewish apparel even. And so that's basically what we mean. And that's how we're going to be using the word, is that people who are not Jews, but who are becoming kind of Jewish-ish, if that makes any sense. They're Jew-lite. Then what is Judophilia? Well, first of all, it comes from the word Yehud, meaning Jew, and Philein, which means to love. It's basically the antonym of Judophobia, or, this irrational fear of Jews. And so then this kind of gets into what is Judophobia, which is what many Christians had during medieval times. They heard these rumors about Jews poisoning wells and killing children and putting their blood in matzahs. And so people naturally became afraid of Jews based on these rumors. And so I would like to read a little bit from the book here, In the Shadow of the Temple. And we're just going to learn a little bit here. From what we have seen above, it would be reasonable to conclude that the Constantinian era, which we're not quite there yet, but we will be getting into that next week, that the Constantinian era heralded an increase in anti-Semitic attitudes among Christians, rather than the opposite. And if we stick to utterances by church leadership, councils, and imperial legislation, that is no doubt true. Almost all preserved literary and documentary sources represent the above-mentioned authorities and their points of view, and there is no doubt that we have a very pronounced anti-Judaism in these sources. And one thing that I like about this book is that it has footnotes instead of endnotes. The endnotes give all of the additional statements and sources at the end of the chapter, the end of the book. But this has footnotes, so then we can go right down to the bottom of the page and we can find sources for this information and additional comments, which we're not going to read just because they're not totally relevant, but just kind of a perk of the book. And Professor Scarsana goes on and says, but, and this is often overlooked, these same sources, often indirectly testify to quite different attitudes among those to whom they are directed. When bishops warned their flocks not to socialize with Jews, this must mean that at least some Christians socialized with Jews. When Christian councils passed canons, or laws, forbidding Christians to visit synagogues or to take part in Jewish festivals, probably meant that at least some Christians did so. The very existence of these anti-Jewish measures and the need to repeat them and even sharpen them all through antiquity and during the early medieval ages is eloquent testimony to the untold and written story of Christian philo-Semitism, which is basically what we're describing as Judophilia, the love of Jews. It seems to have been very much a Christian grassroots phenomenon. So basically, to put it quite crudely or bluntly, it was the clergy that was the most anti-Semitic, and the lay people that were not. And unfortunately, the toxicity from on top sunk into the lay people and eventually contaminated it from the top down. And so basically what we're talking about are all of the lay people. We're not talking about the professional preachers and bishops. We're talking about the common folk who, they have Jewish neighbors. They see Jews walking around, and they're hearing all these nasty things about Jews, but they say, I know Shmuley, we live right next door, he's a great guy, I babysat for him, and, he watches my dog, and we're friends, right? We don't eat together, but what's the big deal? Quit your fetching. So, that's kind of the attitude of many lay people. So in terms of Gentile attitudes toward Jews, we've kind of already discussed this, but let's just review it very briefly and quickly. In the pre-Christian era, which is basically before the mid-100s, Christians obviously existed before this, but this is they were very small and few and far between. So in the pre-Christian era, before the mid-100s, there was a dislike of the Jews for strange customs and separateness, right? They stuck to themselves. They didn't integrate into society. Now, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, where they didn't worship the gods of Rome or of Greece or Egypt, and they were accused of being haters of humanity. And this was actually a charge that was eventually leveled against Christians as well, because they did not worship the gods of Rome. And so, basically, you call somebody a hater of humanity. It's like saying, we can't really pinpoint anything that you do wrong. You just hate people, right? You're just antisocial. You're evil. But, on the flip side, there were some who had admiration toward the Jews for possessing a very ancient religion, right? The Greeks said, your religion's crazy, but it's so old there must be something to it. And the Romans kind of adopted this policy when they were instituting their own policy of religio licita. Remember the religions that are licit, that are legal, right? If something is illicit, it is illegal. And so, after this time, once the Christian era kind of started occurring or coming into being, or once the Christian movement really took off among Gentiles, there was a lot of negative feelings toward Jews, and rarely did you have positive ones. But again, this PowerPoint is about the positive ones, because it's not well known. In terms of some negative ones, there was the dislike of Jews for continuing to follow the Torah. Right? They weren't hurting anybody, they just kept following the Torah. And many of these Gentile Christians were infuriated that Jews kept doing this. And when I'm talking about Gentile Christians, I'm not really talking about the lay people. Again, I'm talking about the clergy, the leaders. Maybe I should be a bit more specific about that. But it was many of these leaders, the theologians, the bishops, and so on, were infuriated. Like, what on earth are you continuing to follow this old law for, right? We're set free from it. What on earth are you doing? And then after a while, they were accused of just being stubborn God haters, right? You're so obstinate. You know the truth. You just don't want to accept it. Why? There's no rational reason. You just must hate God. There was also dislike of Jews for being, quote, assassins of Christ. And then eventually the charge was increased and became they were killers of God. They were God killers, which the term for that is deicide. It's the murder of a deity. Now from the book, In the Shadow of the Temple, that is, it says, from what we have seen above, it would seem... I'm sorry, I already read this. It would seem reasonable to conclude that the Constantinian era heralded an increase in anti-Semitic attitudes among Christians rather than the opposite. And this was basically among church leadership as I've established. So we're not going to read that again because you can just not fast forward, but back forward? No, rewind. That's the word I'm thinking of. You can just rewind and read it there. But anyways, in terms of positive ones, there was admiration towards Jews for being holy, wise, biblical people, the chosen people of God. And there's many Gentiles who, again, we're talking about the lay people now, the common people, who looked at the Jews and they said, look, they're kind of out there, and these are the Bible is about these people, right? Their grandpa was, the prophet Elijah, or their grandpa was King David, or their grandpa was this person, or their grandma was Ruth, or, this is not, the Jews were not just following a religion, they were embracing their historical experience of being the chosen people of God, the people of the Bible. And so some Christians really admired this, and they really latched onto it, and they're like, wow, this is really cool. You don't just know God because it's your religion. You have been with God, and God has been with you the whole time, and you have this really weird special connection with Him. And that's really cool. And another positive attitude that they have, kind of branching off into this, is that this resulted in Christians often having mixed feelings and mixed relationships with Jews, because there's this negativity coming down on them from the bishops and the pastors and the preachers, but the lay people saw all of the good that Jews had to offer, that they were involved with, that they experienced, and they said, something's just not adding up. Right? So they kind of took a positive but cautious view sometimes, and then once they got to know these Jews, they're like, well, these people are actually great people. What's wrong? Why are you being so mean to them? Also, all of this needs to be interpreted within the light of the Greco-Roman admiration for ancient religions and the ancient Jews. Actually, I'm sorry. Let me go back. The Greco-Roman admiration for the ancient Jews became the Christians' disdain for the ancient and old, outdated ways of the Jews. So basically, I think what I was trying to say there is that the Greco-Romans really valued old stuff because it was time-tested, and in their mind it was provable, it was good, and it was better than new stuff. When these Gentile Christians come along, and I don't mean to say this in a derogatory way, there's nothing wrong with being a Gentile, when these Christians who were Gentiles came along, they inherited this mindset that the Jews are very ancient and therefore good. But in their minds, they said the Jews are very ancient, therefore bad, because Jesus has done away with all the old stuff and now we have the new stuff. And so that's kind of their mindset about that. So in terms of their connections with the Jews, their connections with Jewish practices and so on, I wanted to first just cover, because we know that Nazarut, Nazareneism, kind of transformed eventually into Christianity. And so I figured what we could do is just look at first the continuation of Nazarene practices for Christians, because there wasn't just this big split. It wasn't just, the date has changed, it's a new day, and we're going to be Christians now. It was not so clear, it was not so cut and dry. And so I want to look at some correlations between Nazarene and Christian practices with traditional Jewish ones, which the Nazarenes would have been doing. And so from the book it says, we shall collect examples from these important sources. The Didache, which is from about 100, Justin Martyr, which is the middle of the 100s, and Hippolytus and his apostolic tradition, which is in the early 200s. And compare them with Jewish evidence, rabbinic and Greek. Before going into some detail, we make the following overall comparison. So there's two columns on the page. It says Christian baptism, and then the column on the right says Jewish proselyte baptism. And it goes from passage to passage and just compares them. What were Christians doing? What were Jews doing in this subject? So, according to Hippolytus's apostolic tradition, 16:2, the candidates are, these are all paraphrases by the way, the candidates are asked about their motives for conversion. So, why do you want to be a Christian? Likewise, in the Talmud, it says that candidates are asked about their motives for conversion, right? The same thing. Why do you want to be a Jew? You're doing this for economic reasons, because you want to marry a Jew. You know, these are bogus. You have to do it because you actually love God. The candidates must have witnesses who can guarantee their sincerity. Apostolic Tradition 16:2. According to the Talmud, Yevamot 46b, it says 2 or 3 witnesses are required at a baptism for converts to Judaism. Christian, pre-baptismal instruction in ethical catechism. So basically, you're taught what it means to be a Christian, and basically it's your last chance. Do you want to do this or not? Likewise, for Jews, it says instruction in some of the heavier and some of the lighter commandments. So basically, love one another, keep kosher, observe the Sabbath. These are kind of the lighter things. And, I mean, obviously the one God is fundamental. Then they'd also be taught a few of the more obscure commandments, just to give them some variety, just to give them a feeling for what they're getting into. Like leaving a hedge around their field so that the poor can eat from that. Or maybe some of the laws pertaining to sacrifices. For Christians, immediately before baptism, there was an exorcism, prayer, and fasting, because it was believed that non-Christians probably had a demon in them or something. For Jews, there wasn't really any formal practice like this, but we do find an account of it in the apocryphal book, or pseudepigraphal book, Joseph and Asenath, where Joseph's wife, this Egyptian, the daughter of an Egyptian priestess, which we actually do read about in Genesis, but this is a legendary story that kind of grew out of that. His wife was found praying and fasting before she converted, or around the time that she did. For Christians, the candidate must renounce the devil and reject idol worship. For Jews, again, this is Asenath. Asenath renounces the devil and all idols. So this is kind of the same thing. It's not exact one for one, but there's a general practice relating to a specific practice. For Christians, baptism preferably in living water, but also in a basin as well. For Jews, baptism in flowing waters or in a mikveh. And actually in the Mishnah, it says, here's all the different grades of a mikveh, from a drainage ditch to a river or ocean, right, with flowing water to take away the impurity. And so basically it's the same idea that's going on right here. For Christians, water to touch every part of the body, and women should loose their hair, meaning they should untie their hair or unbraid their hair, and take off all jewelry, and nobody must bring an alien object with them, so they can't be holding a cup or a bowl or an iPhone, because we know that they all had iPhones back then. And for Jews, the water must touch every part of the body, and women should untie their hair, and nobody should let an object come between the water and their body. And this, again, according to the Talmud, it's the same thing. For Christians, after baptism, participation in the first Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, communion, bringing bread and wine as the first offering. For Jews, after baptism, participation in the first Passover meal, and they bring a sacrifice. And so for the early Christians who considered the Eucharist, the communion, to be a literal sacrifice, not a spiritual sacrifice, but a literal sacrifice on a table in a church, or a house church even, it was kind of going back to this idea that the Jews, when somebody was converting to be a Jew, often it would be right before Passover, and so they would convert, and then maybe a few days later, maybe even just 1 or 2 days later, they would participate in their first Passover, which I find this is extremely exciting and interesting because what does Yeshua say at the end of Matthew 28? Go and make disciples, right? And what's the biggest holiday for the Nazarenes? Pesach, right? And so, I don't know. I find the correlation interesting. And so, getting back to the PowerPoint, according to Talmud Bavli, it says, when he is immersed and come up, he is like an Israelite in all respects. So, this is kind of like in the early Christian document, the Shepherd of Hermas, 9:16:4, where it says they go down into the water dead and come up alive. So, no, he's not saying that he becomes an Israelite, but it's the same idea when you understand the Jewish view of becoming an Israelite. You are entering into life, because it says in Deuteronomy, between chapters 28 and 32, I believe, right? There's choose life and choose death. Choose the Torah or choose disobedience. And the Torah is connected with life, with Chaim. Chaym. Chaim. And so when you embrace the Torah, when you enter the covenant and become an Israelite, you are embracing life. And this kind of goes back to the Christian idea of, or rather the Christian idea goes back to the Jewish idea, that when you go into the water, you are a spiritually dead person. When you come up, when you come out, and when you re-enter the air, kind of like a baby entering the air from the womb for the first time, again, it goes back to being born again, which is also a Talmudic concept. You come up alive. You enter life. Also, it's interesting that we we don't do today. People would immerse completely naked, and if you're uncomfortable with that, that's just what they did back then. And what's funny is because for as extremely modest as they were, it kind of surprises me, although it does make sense. It still kind of surprises me that an exception would be made for this. Now, granted, they would try to do this in modest ways, so maybe there'd be a curtain down by the river that somebody would hold up, and you'd go behind the curtain or something. I know also technically, if you wanted to be converted in some situations, you can wear a very, very loose-fitting robe, but it's really not preferable. But what else is interesting is that for some, they would give you a robe once you came out of the water to, symbolize the righteousness that robes represent. Kind of like when we were talking about the point of Yeshua's death, we were talking about how the robe represents righteousness, and actually this is a concept found in Judaism and in the book of Revelation when the saints receive their robes, right? And so when people come out, what's interesting is that there's the laying on of hands to confer the Holy Spirit in Christianity. And while there isn't a correlation to this in Judaism as far as I know, when rabbis were ordained, they would lay hands on one another to confer the Holy Spirit and the authority of Moses. So, it's kind of the same thing, but it's not a perfect correlation. Also, for Christians, there was immersion right before Passover, and converts to both Judaism and Christianity did this, although for somewhat different reasons, but not totally different reasons. And so, if you wanted to get into the details of that, maybe we can discuss it in the comments section or something. But, again, they're relatively similar. They're very similar in some ways, a little similar in others. But, continuing with other Nazarene practices. In terms of communal meals, for Gentile Christians, there was still this observance of Pesach and Shavuos, or Passover and Weeks, the Feast of Weeks. Which, from what I understand, most Christians, by the way, Shavuos means, is Pentecost in Greek. And I don't know why, but I don't think that a lot of churches still do that anymore. Am I correct in that? Does your church do that? I don't know. I know growing up mine did not. I don't even know if there was a special sermon for Pentecost. But, but when Pesach became Easter and churches started doing, a crucifixion sermon on that day and then talking about other stuff for the rest of the year. Things changed when it went from a communal meal to a communal sermon. But back in ancient times, they did actually get together. They did actually eat together. They would celebrate, and sometimes they would either sing songs or give a little sermon here or there, or some words of encouragement. These are pretty common things for back then. There was also the Master's Seder, which is kind of the Judaized form of the Lord's Supper, right? Because do people say supper a whole lot anymore? I know some people do. But the Lord's Supper sounds very English, right? Very 16th century English. Which, again, there's nothing wrong with being English. I'm speaking it right now. But a more accurate idea is the Master's Seder. And so this is kind of a part of Passover, but it also became this weekly thing that many believers did to remember not only that final meal, that final Pesach Seder, but also the eating that Yeshua did with the disciples after he resurrected. Because remember, in one account, he's on the beach cooking fish. At this other time, he enters into a house and he's eating with them. And so he's eating after the resurrection. So these are kind of things that some people believe are reminiscent of Yeshua's post-resurrection eating and meals with the disciples. There was also fasting with prayer. Not fasting and prayer, but you're fasting, and while you're fasting, you're praying. And what's interesting, according to the Didache, which is this first century, maybe early second century document, but more likely the late first century, that it says for Christians that Christians ought to fast on Wednesday and Friday. Why on earth would they say Wednesday and Friday? Well, it's because in traditional Judaism, they would fast on Monday and Thursday. And so Yeshua's comments about do not pray like the hypocrites and don't fast like the hypocrites and so on was interpreted by later people to mean, oh, well, if the Jews are fasting and praying on Mondays and Thursdays, we can't be like them, so we're going to move it. Let's move it to Wednesday and Friday. And what's fascinating, even though they did this, in the Didache it still calls Friday the day of preparation. Which at this time, Saturday was still a highly revered day by many, even Gentile Christians. And even in some Orthodox churches today, Saturday still has a very prominent role in their religious life. Now, Sunday has more prominence, but the very fact that they respect it at all goes back to this time when Christians are still thinking of Friday as the preparation day, which nobody does anymore, other than maybe, Seventh-day Adventists. And there's still respect for Shabbat. Even if they're not observing it, they're still considering it a holy day. They recognize that there is holiness from God, and not just because the Jews decided to get together like, oh, let's have a holy day today. There's also the thrice daily prayers, which in Hebrew it's Shacharis, Mincha, and Mariv. And there's basically this gentilized versions that come about. And they become the thrice daily recitation of Tefillas Rabbeinu, which is basically what we might think of as the Lord's Prayer, or the Our Father. So, in Hebrew, it would be, what? Avinu Shabashamayim, our Father in heaven, Yitchadesh Shimcha, may your name be sanctified, or hallowed be thy name, right? And so this is basically a practice. People, the Gentile Christians, would recite the Lord's Prayer 3 times every day, presumably around the times that Shacharis, Mincha, and Mariv were also recited by Jews, which, it's interesting. We don't do this today, but if it was so important to them, why is this not also important to us as well? And I'm not saying that we need to copy everything that they did, but it is just it's it's proof that they were looking to the Jews for inspiration, for guidance, and for, how to live. There's also this question of what many people call Sunday observance, which you can't really observe a day because, if you're alive during that day, you're observing it happen right before your very eyes, assuming that you are blessed with sight. But what we mean is that people gathering on the first day of the week, referring to some events that happen in Acts, and also events that are recorded by the early church fathers. And so, this kind of goes back to a quote from Acts 20 verse 7, where it says, "On the first day of the week we came together to break bread, and Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight." Now, I always thought this sounded kind of funny. Paul needed to get going, so he stayed and talked. But I think it's clear that this is not actually what Luke is trying to say here, right? What does it mean? Well, first, the Jews like Paul, we know that Paul was a Jew. He says, "I am a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the seventh day, a Pharisee as to the law." So we know he's a rather Jewish bloke who has no qualms about being private about this. He's very adamant. I am Jewish. And so to Paul, who was a Jew, the seventh day was sundown on Friday and began Shabbat, right? So Shabbos begins on Friday evening, but for Jews, that is the beginning of the seventh day, at sundown, not at midnight according to the Roman calendar. And so, if there are 7 days in a week, and Friday evening begins the seventh day, Saturday evening begins the first day. So from, depending on what time of year it is, roughly around maybe 8 o'clock, 8:30, maybe even 7:30, from that time, around 8 o'clock to midnight on Saturday, is when Paul almost certainly would have been teaching. Because once it hits Saturday evening, after sundown, that's the beginning of the first day. And so if Shaul, Paul, had been in the synagogue with his fellow Jews, he comes home, and the Nazarenes are kind of having their own shindig go on. They're getting together, and they're talking about Yeshua, and they're talking about being Hasidim, which remember, be Hasidim. And they're talking about repentance, and the Messianic era, and the kingdom, and all this good stuff. What's more likely, that he stayed overnight and talked? He woke up early in the morning, Sunday morning, 5:30, and he's talking until midnight. Do you know how your throat would probably be so hoarse, I guess, so hoarse and dry and tired out, and you could start coughing up blood. This is a terrible situation to be in. You don't want to do that. So what does Paul do? The most likely and probable thing that he does is that after Shabbat, around 8:30-ish, right, at evening, after sundown, he stays and talks to the local Nazarenes for a few hours, but he says, "I'm only going to go till midnight because I got to wake up early and leave on Sunday morning." Right? He's leaving Sunday morning, but he's talking Saturday night. So which one's more reasonable? That he's talking for a few hours afterwards, which, people do today, or that he's talking from sunup to sundown the entire Sunday and then he leaves Monday? That he's talking on Saturday night, right? According to Pliny the Younger, which he was a Roman, we've talked about him a little bit before, and his daddy, Pliny the Elder, I think that they were related. According to Pliny the Younger, he says the Christians met on Sunday before dawn, which means that it was before the sun came up on Sunday, meaning that it was dark. Meaning, what? It's after Shabbat. They would sing hymns, and they would exhort each other to do good works and abstain from evil. Now, based on these words alone, yes, you could say it was either Saturday night or super early Sunday morning before work. Because remember, to Romans, Sunday was a holy day for Romans, but they didn't not work. They still went to work. but it's just the special day that they remembered the sun god. Now, could you say that they met Saturday night? Yes. Could you say that they met super early Sunday morning at, 4 o'clock or something? It's conceivable. But I think that at least the earliest tradition of this going on is still going to be Saturday night. However, I will give you this. Over time, meetings got later and later in the day, resulting in meeting very, very early Sunday morning to regular Sunday morning to late Sunday morning to Sunday afternoon. And so people were going, basically what we would think of as going to church, right? They would meet, the Nazarenes and the Christians, namely just the Christians, would meet on Sunday morning or afternoon, which is why most church services are in the morning or afternoon. And they would, quote, gather together at one place in the memoirs of the apostles, i.e. the Gospels, or the writings of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Moses, are read as long as time permits. Now, what's really interesting, there's this passage in Shadow of the Temple that I could just summarize for you, but I think that Oscar Scarsano does a much better job than me. And so we're going to be reading this little bit from the book. Let's see. Okay, it says, the scripture reading of the ancient synagogue was twofold. A reading from the Torah, either in a 3 to 3.5 year cycle in the land of Israel, or a 1 year cycle in Babylon, probably from the 2nd century AD to the present practice. So basically, this is what's been going on for almost 2,000 years. Which, by the way, when you have a 1 year cycle, that means that in 3 years you're reading the Torah 3 times in Babylon. In the land of Israel, you had a 3 year cycle, which means that you're reading the entire Torah only once in 3 years. Which means that the Babylonian Jews are reading the Torah 3 times as much as the Judean Jews. So people want to say, oh, Babylonian is evil. Yeah, they're reading the Bible 3 times as much. If they were so pagan, they wouldn't be reading it. And they're going to know it better, arguably. Secondly, a suitable reading from the prophets to supplement the Torah reading, the Haftarah. The Haftarah refers to the passage from the prophets, which means the supplement or the completion. In the 1st century AD, these readings were probably not yet fixed, meaning the books and the passages were not yet determined, but could be chosen from time to time. And as evidence of this, the author says, look at Luke 4:17. Many scholars believe that from the beginning, the Gospels were read in Christian worship, very much like the Torah in Jewish worship. That is, the Gospels were read in continuous order, meaning from start to finish, and the readers taking up next Sunday where they left off the Sunday before. When Justin Martyr says that the reading is continued each Sunday, quote, as long as time permits, this would indicate such a continuous reading. To this gospel reading, an appropriate Haftarah from the prophets would then be added. And again, as the quote says, if time permits. And so basically, the Gentile Christians, because much of the Torah just didn't apply to them, there wasn't much of a point to do it. They started reading the memoirs or the gospel accounts of the apostles, and after that they would read a passage from the prophets just as the Jews were doing in the synagogues. And so, again, we see a continuation and kind of an adaptation of this practice. I'd also like to read another passage from a few pages later. And this is in regards to the observing of Pesach, or Passover, which was eventually called Easter for whatever reason. But even in Latin, Pesach is called Pascha. Right? It's the same thing. It's Pascha. It's Passover. Pesach. So Professor Scarsano writes, the only festivals of the Jewish calendar that coincided with fundamental events in the life of Jesus and the first community of disciples were Passover and weeks, Shavuot, Pentecost. These, accordingly, underwent a reinterpretation and modification and were observed by all believers, whether they be Jewish or Gentile. The other festivals of the Jewish calendar were certainly observed by the Jewish believers, the Nazarenes, but as but as national, not Jesus-centered festivals, and therefore not by Gentile believers. So basically, because Pentecost or Shavuot had significance to the life of the early believers and to Yeshua himself, these were observed by all Christians and the Nazarenes, but the Nazarenes were the only ones who continued to observe the other holidays as well, religiously. Sometimes Gentiles would join Jews, but they didn't do so out of, I have to do this because it's an obligation. The Nazarenes, on the other hand, because they were all Jews, religiously and ethnically, they said, we do have this obligation because of our covenant relationship with God, and in marriage, it's a two-way street. We have to do some things, and he has to do some things, because that's what marriage is, right? And so the East, like when we're talking about the East, we're talking about Turkey, Syria, Israel, Persia, to a certain extent. And when we're talking about the West, we're generally talking about Europe. So basically Greece and Italy and France at this time. The East generally sided with the Jews and fasted on the 14th of Nisan and following John's chronology. So if you are aware, there's different dates for Yeshua's death between the Synoptic Gospels and John's Gospel. And so this caused a problem. Is that you basically had to take sides if you wanted to celebrate it in accordance with when Yeshua was crucified. So the East generally sided with the Jews, and they even fasted the day before Passover, which, I did this past year because there's a practice so that the firstborn fast before Passover, and I'm the firstborn, and so I figured, well, I'll fast. But this is something that they all did back then, that the churches of the East did. However, the West generally sided with the Synoptics chronology and observed it on the first Sunday after the 15th of Nisan. So this led to the famous Quarto-Deciman controversy. And what the word Quarto-Deciman means the 14thers. It sounds kind of like a funny word, right? The 14thers. It's like Panthers. That same phoneme at the end. But anyways, they were called the 14thers because they started on the 14th of Nisan, the Nisan being the Jewish month. And so basically, there was an east-west divide where the West said, no, we're going to basically do it our own way, the way that we interpret Scripture, which they would include the New Testament as Scripture. And the East said, the Jews have been doing this for like 1,500 years. You realize that, right? We think they know what they're doing. So we're going to do what they do. You can go make up your own stuff, right? And so this caused a big problem. And this is why there was this 14ther controversy, the Quarto-Deciman controversy. And at the Council of Nicaea, it was decided which side was going to be right, the East or the West. But who ended up winning in the end was the West. So that the West rejected the Jewish date for Passover. And this is the kind of the beginning of Easter, how Passover turns into Easter. However, before all that happened, in the 100s and the 200s, you would find that usually on Pascha, or Pesach in Hebrew, you would have these Christian pastors and bishops preaching sermons. And we know this because of people like Melito of Sardis and also Barnabas, who is not the biblical Barnabas, it's a different Barnabas, and other people who we actually still have their sermons on Passover recording what they were doing. And so basically what's really interesting is that these sermons, a lot of times from the 100s and the 200s, borrowed from Haggadic imagery. Remember, the Haggadah is the Jewish, quote, retelling of the Exodus story and the liberation from Egypt. And so basically they would spiritualize a lot of these events, and they would say, going into Egypt is being in a life of sin, and then Moses comes in and brings you out of Egypt, like Jesus comes into your life, and then he brings you to Mount Sinai, and you have salvation at that point. And that corresponds to Jesus bringing you to the gospel, and then you have salvation at that point, right? So they were kind of spiritualizing these themes and trying to make them applicable also, and relevant also. I guess that would be a better word, more relevant to Gentiles. In terms of the Festival of Weeks, or Shavuos, here's a quote from the book. There is every reason to think that below the surface there are many subtle lines of connection between Jewish Shavuot and Christian Pentecost. In several scripture reading cycles of the post-Constantinian Church, Exodus 19 crops up as the reading for the Sunday of Pentecost. This is hardly directly derived from the New Testament, and it testifies to continued points of contact between Jews and Christians. So again, it just kind of points back to these connections with Judaism. Still, even for these Gentiles in the 100s and 200s. And by the way, Exodus 19 is about Moses going up to Mount Sinai to learn the entire Torah, to get the Torah, and then to bring it back down to Israel. And something that I thought was really interesting, in Ephesians 4:8 and Psalm 68:18 are connected. And basically what this psalm is referring to is Moses, but Paul applies it as a pesher to Yeshua. So he's not saying, oh, it doesn't mean Moses, it actually means Yeshua. He's saying, yes, it applies to Moses, but we can also apply it to Yeshua. I'm trying to think of what the exact passage is. I think it's the one where he says, he ascended on high bringing gifts or bearing gifts or something like that. This is actually referring to Moses going up to Mount Sinai and bringing down the Torah. And so, that's what that's referring to. But I think that those correlations are very interesting. So, in terms of respect for the rabbis and the Jewish people, we are going to begin with a little story about a guy named John Chrysostom, which in Greek, Chrysostom means the golden-mouthed. He had a very golden mouth because, not because he cursed a lot, but maybe he did, I don't know. But he was a very popular preacher during his time. And if I'm thinking of the same guy, he might have cursed a lot. At least the equivalent back then. He was not a very nice guy. But John Chrysostom was a bishop in Antioch, Syria. And so he probably would have had some contact with some Nazarenes. They weren't too popular at this time, but there did remain some of their influences. So he was in Syria, and some of his congregants were attending synagogue services on Saturday and then attend church services on Sunday. This infuriated him, moving him to write 8 sermons called Against the Jews. These were not really addressed to Jews specifically, but rather to Christian Judaizers, which is interesting. So basically, you're not directly attacking your people, but you're attacking the people that your people like. So basically, you have Judaizers in your congregation, and you come up saying the Jews are evil, the Jews are stupid, the Jews are ungodly, they worship devils, and so on. And all of these Judaizers in the congregation are, coughing at certain points, and or, they're walking out, or, whatever they're doing. He's trying to make them feel uncomfortable and kind of bully them into stop going to the synagogues. A quote from In the Shadow of the Temple, it says, the Judaizers were not blamed for something they believed or taught or said, but for something they did. And this is really interesting because Christianity is mostly a religion of beliefs, right? Do you believe this? Do you believe that? You have to believe to be saved. But here is John Chrysostom kind of bullying people because of something that they did, which it was not necessarily incompatible even with the Orthodox Christian belief at this time. He just didn't like it because he didn't like Jews. And what's interesting, we have some great quotes from him. And here's one. He says, What is it that you are rushing to see in the synagogue? I don't know, Johnny. How about you come and see for yourself? How about that? Um, he says elsewhere, Chrysostom says that these Christian Judaizers were caught fasting between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and then celebrating Sukkos, or tabernacles, all at the Jewish synagogues. And so these Christians are celebrating the feast days. I guess Yom Kippur is not a feast day, it's just a festival day. But they're celebrating the biblical holidays with the Jews. They're having a mighty fancy time, and they're loving it, and they're having a great time fellowshipping and celebrating God. And here's Chrysostom here to ruin the fun. How dare you fellowship with Jews and have a bunch of food and party and pray? How dare you? They also attended traditional Pesach Seders. I remember Passover Seders. And Chrysostom says, you observe with them the fellowship of the festivals, and you go to their profane places, and enter their unclean doors, and share in the table of demons. Right? Basically, the way that Chrysostom is seeing these people, basically they're sprouting horns and they have a 666 tattoo on their faces or something. Because, I mean, this is just the end of the world for him. He also criticized, how can we blame the Jews for waiting for you in their houses when it is you who go running to them? So clearly, we have a lot of people from his church kind of running away from church and joining the Jews. Many, I know, respect the Jews and think that their present way of life is a venerable one. Now, what does this say about Chrysostom himself? I think that if people are running away and joining his enemies, I think that he's got a bigger problem. There's also, just kind of to wrap us up, there's some pages that I would like to read, hopefully kind of quickly. It says the Judaizers also visited the synagogues. And this is the quote from Chrysostom, what are you rushing off to see? In his own polemics, he gave some indications of the real answers of the Judaizers to this question. He says, many are now destroying us and exalting the Jews. Oh no. These men consider the Jews as more trustworthy teachers than their own fathers. This is referring to the fathers of the church fathers. Meaning the bishops. The Judaizers seem to have held the local rabbi in high regard. Not only did they attend the synagogue service, they also preferred the rabbi as a mitigator in their lawsuits. Chrysostom tells us about a Christian husband who took his wife to the synagogue, quote, to swear there an oath about some matters under dispute with them. So basically, they went there for marriage counseling. Chrysostom tried to prevent this. You better not get marriage counseling from a rabbi. And, quote, asked him why he rejected the church and dragged the woman to the place where the Hebrews assembled. He answered that many people had told him that oaths sworn there were more to be feared. So basically, it's more respectable to swear in a synagogue, to make an oath, to promise something, to write up a contract, in a synagogue than a church. What does this say about churches of this time? Chrysostom also tells us that the synagogue building itself was regarded with great reverence by the Judaizers, partly because the Torah scrolls kept in the synagogue were regarded as holy. Quote, since there are some who think of the synagogue as a holy place, I must say a few words to them. Why do you reverence that place? They answer that the law and the books of the prophets are kept there. So basically, what's the big deal about a synagogue? And these people are like, the Bible is there, and that's important because we're living in a time that Gutenberg hasn't invented the printing press yet, so we can't have Bibles, and so if we want to read the Bible, we have to go there. And we do want to read the Bible, and so we want to go to the synagogue. The Judaizers also had in high regard for the Jews as intercessors and physicians in cases of illness. Quote, "You profess you are Christian, but you rush off to their synagogues and beg them to help you." The Judaizers were reporting it and saying, "The Jews promised to make me well, and so I go to them." This doesn't sound like people going to Yeshua at all. You know, we've heard that you can make me well, heal my daughter, heal my son, heal my mother-in-law, says Peter. In all of this, the Judaizers did not convert to Judaism, did not circumcise, and only kept some of the ritual laws. The very fact that Jews were willing to receive them at their tables and have meal fellowship with them, meaning eat with them, is indirect proof that the Judaizers at least obeyed the apostolic decree of Acts 15 concerning blood and strangled animals. Because if they're eating abominations, Jews don't want them in their house. They're not going to eat with them. It is possible that they avoided pork and tried in general to respect the rules of kashrut, or kosher laws, when eating together with Jews. Chrysostom tells us two things more about the Judaizers. First, they seem to have been simple people, so they're not intelligentsia, they're not academic Christian bishop scholars. They were unable to give satisfactory theoretical reasons for their behavior. In other words, this was a grassroots phenomenon much disliked by appointed teachers, such as Chrysostom. So basically what they're saying is that the Judaizers, they weren't totally sure why. They couldn't give the quote-unquote right answer. But they knew deep down in their hearts, this is the right thing that we have to be doing. Right? When we go, it makes sense. When we come to see you, you're not making sense. And we haven't memorized all the scriptures and we haven't memorized all the rationale, but we know it's true. Right? We might not be good debaters, but we are good listeners and we've listened to the truth. Second, the majority of the Judaizers were women, because the men probably would have been encouraged to get circumcised. And women were not. Chrysostom exhorted the husbands to take authority over their Judaizing wives. "Get those women under control," was maybe a quote that he might have said. It seems that a Judaizing wife rather than husband was the typical situation. So this is really attracting the women, and the men are like, yeah, I don't know. They might have knives in those synagogues. Finally, how much of these Philo-Semites were there in the Christian community of Antioch? Like, how big of a problem was this? Chrysostom hints, far too many. So many that one should rather not speak about it. Right, this is the big elephant in the middle of the room. We all know what's going on, folks. Let's just not talk about it, okay? Let us not go around saying, how many people kept the Jewish fast? Rather, let us show concern for them, even if those who observed the fast are many. You, my beloved, must not make a show and parade of this calamity in the church. Right? Don't go around hooting and hollering, oh, it's a huge deal. Even though this is what Chrysostom is doing in his sermons. You must cure it. Right? Because this is a sickness, apparently. If someone tells you that many have observed the fast, stop him from talking so that the rumor may not get around and become public knowledge. Oh, what did you do this weekend? Oh, we went to the synagogue and we fasted, had a great time. Whoa, 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 whoa. Don't talk about it. We can't talk about this. We're too sensitive. You're triggering me. If only this was going on today, that'd be a disaster. These glimpses from Chrysostom in the last decades of the 4th century have considerable exemplary value and should not be regarded as unique exceptions, meaning this was going on everywhere. But how are we to explain this phenomenon in a church whose leadership was against it all the time? If we think of the effect of countless sermons and lectures given in the churches, the existence of Christian anti-Jewish attitudes needs no explanation. But the existence of Philo-Semitism does. Let us reflect a while on its characteristics. The Judaizers were not a sect in the classical meaning of that term. That is, they were not followers of any particular leader. One cannot name any sect founder. Even the old sources do not. Meaning the church fathers don't say, it's this guy's fault. It was not an organized movement. It had no leadership structure of its own. Even the old sources do not speak of the Judaizers as a distinctive group or party. They had no distinctive doctrines, heretical or otherwise. Let's see. It seems Marcel Simon has captured well the situation when he says that the phenomenon of Judaizers does not represent a sect on the fringes of the church, but simply a tendency within the church. Meaning this wasn't a cult, it's just something that was going on at the time. A certain direction that mainstream Christianity took in certain milieus. That mainstream Christianity took in certain milieus. Meaning this was a mainstream thing. This was not psycho fringe stuff going on. One could add that the Judaizing tendency seems to have had few adherents among the clergy, which again, that's interesting. There were a few. It was a lay phenomenon, a common people phenomenon, and many women were involved. So I'm trying to, I think this is going to go on for, actually there's a lot of footnotes, okay. This was looking a little long, and I was a little afraid that we're going to go over time. So I'll try to hurry up here. So how do we explain this phenomenon? Simon points, this is some modern scholar, Simon points quite simply to the social contact between with neighbor Jews. The Judaizing movement seems to have been strongest in areas with strong Jewish colonies. Long story short, there was Jewish colonies all over the Roman world at this time, or Jewish communities. Especially where these colonies were known to have been well integrated into social life and not isolated, right? Be in the world, but not of the world. Same concept. But still, this would explain social contact. It would explain, but it would explain a general friendliness. But why the active participation in Jewish festivals? Why the partial observance of ritual laws far beyond what was necessary for social contact? Meaning, why are these people doing more than the bare minimum? Why are these Gentile Christians being Hasidim? This is the question of our age. Why are they doing this? And perhaps the most puzzling question... Sorry. And perhaps the most puzzling question, how do we explain that these Christians seem to have been received in such a friendly manner by the Jews? Right? Why were these Christians so warmly welcomed by the rabbis? Why? How come when they came to synagogue, the rabbis were like, we're glad to see you, come on in. Here's a cup of coffee and a keychain. No, they didn't do that. At this point, I suggest we take a step beyond Simon and propose an explanation based on the theory of early Christian mission that has been propounded in this book. Briefly summarized, the theory is this. The most important target group for early Christian mission among the Gentiles was the so-called God-fearing Gentiles, the Noahides, the Gerim. That is, the Gentiles who were attracted to Judaism, visited the synagogue, were familiar with the scriptures, the Septuagint, believed in the God of Israel, and tried to conduct their lives according to the moral commandments of the Old Testament and some of the ritual commandments too. Primarily, one would think of the laws of ritual purity. Very likely, they took part in the main festivals of the synagogue community. What would these Gentiles be called by their pagan neighbors? One obvious way of describing them would be to say that they were Judeo-Zontes, Judaizers, Philo-Semites, right? These people that did not convert to Judaism but still adopted many of their practices were becoming Christians, but they didn't give up all of these rich things that they had learned and that the ways that they had been living. Because first of all, there's obviously nothing wrong with it. And two, they liked it. This was not a burden. They loved it. Now, if Christian mission was particularly successful among such people, these converts to Christianity would have been Philo-Semites before they became Christians. Would their conversion to Christianity suddenly make them anti-Semites? Well, no. Well, if our sources do not misinterpret the situation too much, Their local Christian leader would do his best to turn them away from Judaism and their Jewish friends, but would he always succeed? Right? Don't hang out with those Jews. They're evil. Well, I've known them for years. They seem like good people. They're very friendly. They're very charitable. No, 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 no. They're evil. Oh, why is that? Because they killed Jesus. Not all of them did. Well, we know that, but they're all evil. Right? This sounds very divisive, doesn't it? Separating families and saying, don't talk with them, and sounds very much like a cult. This would explain. If you've ever studied cults, that's actually one of the telltale signs of a cult. Don't talk to your family if they don't join the movement. This would explain the grassroots character of this movement and the female majority, which was characteristic of the God-fearer group, or the Noahide group. This would explain the active involvement with Jewish festivals, the Jewish calendar, kashrus regulations, or kosher, trust in the rabbinical courts, etc. In short, the explanation we propose for the phenomenon of Christian Judaizers is not that some Christians became Judaizers, but that many Judaizers became Christians. In conclusion, we should notice that the date of Chrysostom's evidence for this lively Christian-Jewish contact, the late 380s. This is 3.5 centuries after the time of Yeshua. This is not the 1st century, this is the 4th century. 60 years after the anti-Jewish measures of Nicaea in the Passover-Easter question, right? The Quartodeciman controversy. 60 years after Constantine's embrace of Christianity and the beginning of anti-Jewish legislation by the Christian Empire. And it goes on and talks about other people. And what's interesting, kind of the postscript to this chapter, talks about how this would be an issue even into the Middle Ages. And what's funny is that this actually started spreading among scholars, where Christian scholars, they start going to rabbis and they say, they start learning Hebrew, they start learning these Jewish interpretations and so on. And it's hilarious that it's like the whole time the establishment's trying to put it down, but the people know the truth. And they don't need to be told that these people are evil because they can see that they're good. And so, concluding for today. As time went on, Christian attitudes toward Jews were mixed. The leaders felt negatively, and the lay people often, although not always, had positive views. And I don't mean to oversimplify this either, saying, it's the man who's keeping us down, right? There was just a lot of leaders that didn't like Jews, and there was a lot of lay people that did. And it wasn't 100% for both, but it was nonetheless a lot of people. Also, the Christians continued some Nazarene practices. So we're talking about what you might call Judeo-Christianity at this time, not pure Orthodox Christianity. The Philo-Semitic, or Noahide Christians, attended synagogue services, just as it is taught in Acts 15, which is what James said was going to happen. And I don't know if this is a commandment or a prophecy, but it happened. And they observed the holidays. The Christian clergy became fiercely anti-Jewish, and this has been the case for most of Christian history, even into the 20th century, before the restoration of the State of Israel in 1948. And so unfortunately, the bad guys won. But they won the battle, they didn't win the war. And so that's important. That's why there was always, if you want to use political language, these resistance movements, kind of these people that were very sympathetic to Jews, that they didn't hate Jews. They talked with Jews, they fellowshipped with Jews, they worshipped with Jews, they learned from Jews in the fulfillment of prophecy. Right? 10 Gentiles from among the nations will come and they'll take the garment of a Jew, they'll grab a Jew. Uh-oh, what's going to happen? And they'll say, "Take us with you, because we've heard that God is with you." The implication being God's not with us. God's with you. We want to go with you. The nations will cry out, "See, we have inherited nothing but lies and vanity from our forefathers, profitless things." This was happening. This was about to be fulfilled. But unfortunately, it was crushed by the forces of darkness, which is a Kabbalistic term that we'll be getting into later. But basically, the bad guys won the battle, but they didn't win the war. And so what we have in modern times, we have movements like the Messianic movement, the Hebrew roots movement, the Torah observant movement among Christians, and the whole other alphabet soup amount of names that is describing these people that are reading the Bible. They're being inspired by the Nazarenes, and they're saying, let's do it. Let's go for it. Let's return to the roots of our faith. And basically, these are the people, these are the these Noahides back in ancient times, the Philo-Semites or the Judo-Philites. These are the ancestors of the movements that we see today. And so, held you long enough. Hope that this has been a blessing to you. It's been educational and either intentionally or accidentally entertaining at times. So I will leave you with that. And remember, this is the sole duty of mankind. Ecclesiastes 12:13, to fear God, keep the commandments, and as always, remember to be Hasidim.
Sometimes your world comes crashing down. You ask, why me? Why now? Why now? Your mind is fighting for sanity. All you gotta do is say, la 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 gamzuli tova, la 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 gamzuli tova, la 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 gamzuli